Hi, I'm Marc, and on this channel I talk about Brexit and UK politics. The next parliamentary election must take place by January 25th at the latest, but a whopping 3/4 of those eligible to vote apparently support an earlier date. Almost exactly a year after he took office, the bad news is piling up for British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. According to a survey by the think tank More in Common, 75% of people want a change of government in Britain. Even among die-hard conservatives, the so-called backbone conservatives, a slim majority of 53% were in favor of new leadership. The think tank emphasized on Monday that people are driven by their dissatisfaction with the current political situation and their desire for change. Sunak was elected head of his Conservative Party on October 24th in 22 and was announced by King Charles as Prime Minister on October 25th. The Tories have ruled the country now for more than 13 years, and in all polls, they are clearly behind the Labour Party. As I said, the next parliamentary election must take place no later than January 28th in 2025. The exact date will be decided by Sunak. The Prime Minister recently rejected an early election, and people are currently not interested in voting, he says. Well, they obviously see it differently. More in Common surveyed a total of 2,336 adults in the UK between October 14th and 16th, and the survey was weighed and representative, they say. And Sunak now has been British Prime Minister for a year, but after the recent bankruptcies of his Conservatives, the main question is for how much longer? Rishi Sunak may hope that William Shakespeare is right. A deeper fall often leads to higher happiness, says the famous playwright. And a politician in the United Kingdom can hardly fall much lower than the Prime Minister, who will be in office for exactly 1 year this Wednesday, so today when you see this video. But the happiness that the poet once promised would have to be enormous for Sunak to overcome the massive problems that are piling up before him. The gap between his Conservatives and the polls is enormous. A race to catch up seems unrealistic because the richest Prime Minister in history is considered out of touch. And the British media spoke of a humiliation. The surprisingly clear defeats in 2 by-elections to the British Parliament have recently dealt a further blow to the Tories' self-confidence. You might have seen my video on that. And suddenly even MPs who won their constituencies by a large margin in 2019 have to worry about their seats. And we are currently experiencing the dying days of a destroyed party. That's what Sky News reporter Beth Rigby quoted a former Tory government member as saying. The gap to the Social Democratic opposition Labour Party is a constant 20 points. And if Sunak fails to provide relief, the Tories risk a landslide defeat at the next general election. National debt down, inflation half, economy boost, waiting times in the health service reduce, irregular migration stop. Well, Sunak had announced that he would be measured against this 5-point plan. But the balance sheet speaks against him. Progress is slow and unsteady. That was said by political scientist Tim Bale from Queen Mary University of London. And his colleague Marc is clearer. I quoted him recently in another video. None of the goals have currently been achieved, as the expert from Lancaster University calculates. And rather, national debt and waiting times have recently increased, and tough laws against irregular migration remain ineffective. Sunak, as I said, was elected head of the Conservative Party and successor to catastrophic Liz Truss on October 24th and 22, and then appointed by King Charles on October 25th. That is a jubilee. I don't know who is celebrating that, but Sunak announced at the annual meeting of the Tories a few weeks ago that he stands for change. And that's an extraordinary claim given the fact that the Conservatives have been in power for 13 years and Sunak himself has recently helped shape their policies. He wasn't a complete newcomer. What Sunak touted as long-term solutions for a bright future seemed more like it was born out of necessity. When the Prime Minister, who carries out many appointments by helicopter, relaxed climate protection requirements, Well, even the industry reacted with irritation. As the recent by-elections show, Sunak's messages are not catching on. The first Hindu in Downing Street is not a human catcher. An anonymous Tory MP described him on Sky News, as I said, as having the leadership qualities of an amoeba. Rather, the wealthy former investment banker is considered out of touch. Sunak repeatedly finds himself in the headlines because of the business interests of his wife, whose father founded the Indian IT giant Infosys. The Guardian newspaper recently reported that a fund set up by the then finance minister or chancellor of the exchequer to support startups during the pandemic had paid £2 million to companies in which his wife Akshata Murthy has a stake. And Sunak is still sitting quite securely in the saddle, as expert Garnett says. But that's partly because most Conservative MPs assume the party will lose the next general election anyway. Potential successors are getting into position behind the scenes. Sunak is particularly driven by the loud right wing around Interior Minister or Home Secretary Suella Braverman. With populist phrases about migration, for example, the Prime Minister has moved the Tories further to the right, and the Labour Party is filling the void. And Sunak also by no means has home power, as we would call it. Even internal opponents like former Culture Minister Nadine Dorries like to point out that Sunak was never elected. In the summer of 22, he was initially defeated by Liz Truss in the race to succeed Boris Johnson. It was only when Truss had to resign after a historically short term in office that the parliamentary group quickly promoted him to this office now. And Sunak certainly has some successors, as experts also point out. He stabilized the economy after Truss and regained international respect that had been lost after the troubled Johnson years already. And since Brexit, relations with the EU have never been better than under the more pragmatic Sunak. But this has little impact because Brexit is still there. And rather, the budget statement announced for the end of November could reveal further financial holes. And this is one of the reasons why more and more observers are expecting Sunak to delay the next general election for as long as possible. As I said, the latest possible date is January 25. In fast-moving politics, that's enough time for a U-turn and for the higher happiness described by Shakespeare. But Rishi Sunak has not really dealt with the consequences of Brexit either. And I regularly have to talk about further developments and consequences of Brexit, which is far from over. Now there are discussions about a topic that should have been clear to everyone after the referendum. You know Mallorca, this nice island. It's not only very popular with German tourists, but also with British tourists. And UK travelers looking forward to sunny destinations like Mallorca should prepare for changes in 2024. The European Union is pushing ahead with its post-Brexit entry-exit system, the EES, which is due to come into force later this year. The new system aims to improve border checks and security in the Schengen area, but there are also fears it could lead to chaos. As the UK, no longer part of the EU, prepares for another year of new travel rules, the EU's entry-exit system is a cause for concern. The system is an automated IT system with which travelers from non-EU countries are registered when crossing the EU's external borders. This also includes people with short-term visas and people who are exempt from visa requirements. The EES was greeted with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Implementation has been postponed several times, giving Schengen area countries additional time to prepare for the upcoming changes. These preparations will primarily relate to stricter border checks and increased data collection. Once the EES is fully operational, people traveling to the Schengen area from non-EU countries will be subject to strict entry and exit procedures. This includes registering personal data, including the traveler's name, type of travel document, biometric data like fingerprints and facial images, and the exact date and place of entry and exit. In addition, refusals to enter are also documented. In this transition to more robust border checks, the EU underlines its commitment to respecting fundamental rights and data protection. However, this paradigm shift may introduce some complexity for British tourists traveling to popular holiday destinations in Mallorca, but also anywhere else across the EU. While the full extent of the changes is yet to be seen, it is important for British travellers to keep an eye on evolving regulations and prepare for stricter border checks upon arrival in Mallorca and other EU destinations. Navigating these new travel regulations may require an extra dose of patience and preparedness in the coming year. But even Brexiteers now say the referendum was wrong, at least the way it was conducted. A British government minister has expressed regret that the Brexit referendum did not require a supermajority to pass. And we're talking about Northern Ireland Office Minister and leading Brexiteer Steve Baker here. He made the comments as he suggested a 50% plus one majority would not be advisable for a vote on Irish unification. Oh, suddenly. The 2016 vote on leaving the European Union passed with a roughly 52% to 48% split. On Monday, Mr. Baker told the 65th plenary of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, the BIPA, that the referendum probably should have been a supermajority of at least 60%. And Mr. Baker, who was a strident supporter of withdrawing from the European Union, acknowledged the referendum would have failed under such a supermajority. However, he said such a threshold would have removed the difficulty of politicians not accepting the result. The Northern Ireland minister made the remarks during a question and answer session of the Assembly at the K Club in Kildare in Ireland. He was responding to a question about whether he had any regrets from the Brexit campaign. And he said, "One regret is it probably should have been a supermajority." That's a huge thing to say for me, but because it has been, if it had been a supermajority, we'd have lost and we'd still be in. But the reason I say that it is, if we'd had to have 60%, everybody would have abided by the result. If it had been a 60-40 result, it's inconceivable to me that we would have had all the political difficulty which followed from members of parliament in particular refusing to accept the result. Well, a non-binding referendum, it was another point here, I have to say. The Northern Ireland minister then cautioned against a 50% plus one result in any potential Irish unification vote. And he said, "Would anyone here seriously want a 50% plus one United Ireland result in Northern Ireland?" Well, after some politicians indicated yes, Mr. Baker warned them of the trouble caused by the simple majority caused in the Brexit referendum. He said, "Just reflect on the trouble we had from running a 50% plus one referendum in the United Kingdom and ask yourself whether you really want that trouble in Northern Ireland. And I don't." Last year, Mr. Baker apologized for his former ferocious stance on negotiations with the EU, which he said did not always encourage Ireland to trust the UK government. And I must say that I agree with Mr. Baker here. First of all, it should have been, it could have been easier with a supermajority. But the more decisive point here was it never was a binding referendum. The government said at the time that they would accept the result of the referendum. But this referendum has never been binding for Parliament because it was a non-binding referendum. And those Brexiteers who are still denying that, ask Nigel Farage. He also confirmed that it was a non-binding referendum, and you probably trust him more than you would trust me. But nevertheless, this is the problem with it. And if it's binding, a 50 plus 1 is not such a big problem, because in democracies it's about majorities, and if it's 50 plus 1, it is the way it is. But it was non-binding, and that was the bigger trouble here. Now using this against a border poll in Northern Ireland is, let's say, at least questionable. But if you want to see something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.